Welcome back. This is part 3 in my 5-part projected series on Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, which I'm currently reading very slowly. It is a 1,200-page March Madness, which is I think I started reading it in January, and I'm taking my time. I'm currently now just finished part 3, the Marius section, and I'm on page 705 of 1,200. So we're getting there. So part 3 is entitled Marius. Now, in part 1 and part 2, we've been following primarily the main story of Jean Valjean, Fantine, and Cosette, and Javert. Now, Marius, part 3, they take a back seat. And as I discussed earlier in earlier shows, this book is a sprawl. I mean, this is not a cohesive story of, one or two characters completely going through the book. This book is a sprawling, multi-leveled novel, and it's basically about Les Misérables, which I'll get to a little later because I finally found the quote in the book where the title comes from, and it's pretty beautiful. So at this point, we start off the chapter with a chapter called Paris in Microcosm, and there's a long treatise, as Hugo is wont to do, about Paris at that time and the quality of the street urchins that were kind of inhabiting Paris at that time. And we zoom in on one boy named Gavroche, who is part of a family of the Jondrettes. And we don't know really much about them at this point, except that we do meet them, and he's given us kind of this panoply of what it's like to live in Paris and, the street urchin situation. Quote, "As for the people of Paris, the man fully grown is still the urchin. To paint the child is to paint the town, which is why we have depicted this eagle in the guise of a sparrow. It is above all in the back streets, let us be clear about this, that the real Parisian race is to be found, the pure stock, the true face, in the places where men work and suffer, for work and suffering are the two faces of man. There, in that ant-heap of the humble and unknown, the strangest types exist, from the stevedore of La Râpée to the horse butcher of Montfaucon. Fex ubris, the lees of the city. Cicero called them, and mob was the word. Burke used mob, masses, crowd, public. The words are easily said. But what does that matter? What does it matter if they go barefoot or if they cannot read? Will you abandon them on that account and make of their distress a curse? Cannot light penetrate to the masses? Light, let us repeat it again and again. Light and more light. And then, who knows, opacity may be found to be transparent. Are not revolutions transformations? Let the philosophers continue to teach and enlighten, to think high and speak loud. Turn gladly towards the sunshine, mingle in the marketplace, proclaim the good news, dispense the alphabet, assert men's rights, sing the Marseillaise, foster enthusiasm, pluck the green shoots from the oaks. Turn the idea into a whirlwind. The crowd can be made sublime. We must learn to make use of that great furnace of principles and virtues which sparks and crackles and at moments bursts into flame. Those bare feet and arms, the rags, the ignorance, the abjection, the dark places, all may be enlisted in the service of the ideal. Peer through the heart of the people and you will discover the truth. The common sand that you tread underfoot, let it be cast into the furnace to boil and melt, and it will become a crystal as splendid as that through which Galileo and Newton discovered the stars." Boom! What a beautiful quote. Incredibly beautiful quote. So that ends the Paris in Microcosm. Then we have this chapter called the Grand Bourgeois. And the main subject of this whole section is Marius. And we're introducing Marius' grandfather. Of course, Hugo has to start way at the beginning. As a man named M. Gillenormand. He's a staunch royalist, and we kind of go through his history. Nothing to really comment upon, except, they build his history as he's a very stern man, very much a royalist against Napoleon. And he has kind of exiled Marius' father, who served with Napoleon. So we get to a certain point, and I think that this is Marius' grandfather. So M. Gillenormand's daughter married Marius' father, Pontmercy. The same Pontmercy who Thénardier rescued at the end of the Waterloo chapter, like 1,000 years ago. So that we got like 50 pages of Waterloo for this little moment where we can bring it along and make some melodrama out of it. It's hysterical. So at some point, before Marius even gets to know his dad, his grandfather says, "You're dead to me. You know, you Napoleonic Republican. You're out. I don't want you in the house." And I think the wife had died and the mother had died. So Marius never knows his father for all these years. So that's kind of the setup. And then we get a sense of Marius being brought up. Third chapter, grandfather and grandson. So Marius is raised in kind of an intellectual tradition of the royalists, very anti-Bonaparte, very much into, the Bourbon monarchy. And that's, they think Napoleon is kind of this Satan, this devil. And so Marius is brought up in these salons where he's kind of, indoctrinated in these ideas. Now, at the end of this section, his grandfather basically gets him aside and says, "You're going to take a carriage to this town." And Marius is like, "Why?" He's like, "You're going to go see your father. He's ill." And Marius is like, "Holy cow." So he takes this thing all the way to his dad, and he's too late. Classic Hugo melodrama. His father's dead. So he looks upon his father. He supervises the burial. He knows where he lives. And then in the next few chapters, he becomes enamored of his dad, and he studies his dad, and he begins to worship him as the soldier of the Bonaparte. He becomes a complete Bonapartist. Really is a big deal. So he kind of, after a while comes back to his grandfather and kind of renounces, his royalist upbringing. And his grandfather is like, "You're banished with no money. I never want to see you again." And boom, he's gone. Then there's another chapter, a short section called the ABC Society, which is basically 10 pages on these like 8 to 10 revolutionary personalities that are in and around the salons of Paris, fomenting rebellion, talking about Napoleon and republicanism. And so it's a very lengthy chapter, 10 pages, I should say, not so lengthy. This is where also Marius has a blow up with his grandfather, and kind of that chapter is set up so Marius begins hanging with these revolutionaries in this society. Next chapter, the virtue of misfortune. Marius is now poor, basically living on a shoestring in Paris. I think he gets some money, but it's hardly enough to make a living. So he lives in a tiny room. He's barely scraping by, hanging out with these revolutionaries, kind of wasting away in a sense. During this time, the next chapter, the conjunction of two stars, he spies an old man and a young girl on one of his walks, and he's enamored with the girl. I think at this point, the girl is like 19, maybe earlier. And he's like in love with her. So he winds up following them for a while, and then the father of the girl, recognizes that he's been following them, and then they disappear, and they're gone, and he's kind of bummed out about it. Then another chapter called Patron Minette, which is basically Hugo throwing down on these were the main criminals of society. I don't know if they're real or he made them up. So there's a whole chapter on, them describing all these criminals, which then comes into the next chapter. Now, the last chapter, and there's an excerpt here about these criminals, which is very poetic, which I wanted to read. So at the end of this chapter about the criminals, he writes, quote, "Those men, if one encounters them or simply sees them at midnight in a deserted boulevard, are terrifying. They seem to be not men at all, but figures composed of living mist, as though they were a part of the darkness, having no other existence, and have only momentarily detached themselves from it to live a few minutes a monstrous life." End quote. Like, oh. So that was amazing. So now we have this very long buildup. I'm going to spoil this. If anyone, doesn't want to know what happens at the end of the third book of this, monster novel, check out right now. So basically what's happening now is Hugo has set up this whole melodramatic moment. It's a very long chapter. Like his chapter lengths are so inconsistent. He'll have one that's 10 pages, and then this one I think is like 30 pages. So basically it turns out that Marius lives next to, this family of kind of cut-purses and thieves. It's the Jondrettes that we met earlier. And he bumps into one of the young girls who's one of the daughters of this family. And it seems that they write these scam letters around to get kind of gullible people to contribute, saying that they're poor, destitute, and could you please help, right? So this whole chapter is coincidence writ large. It's what you should never do in fiction, is rely on coincidence. So coincidentally, Marius is living right next door to this family, and there's a hole in the wall where he can peep through and see what's going on in the main room of their house, right? So it turns out that the old man and the girl that he's been spying, it's Jean Valjean and Cosette. There they are. So that's the connection. Marius sees them, right? The Jondrettes are the Thénardiers. They're the ones who initially exploited Fantine and Cosette. And then Jean Valjean took her away from them, right? So they recognize Jean Valjean. He's going by another name now, M. Blanc, Monsieur Blanc, right? Blank slate, I guess. So they recognize who he is, and they want to exploit him. They figure he's rich. So Marius overhears the plot. He goes to the local police station, and he says, hey, there's this group of criminals. They're horrible. They're really going to try to get one over on this very nice man and his daughter who are giving them money. So the policeman there says, okay, we'll set up a trap for them. And, you go back to your apartment and you don't let them know you're home. And when they trick the guy into coming in and they threaten him to get all that money, you fire off one of these revolvers, which we're going to give you. And as soon as we hear the shot, we'll know everyone's there and we'll come in and arrest everybody. Okay, great. So we see through the peephole, and if astute readers will know that Thénardier recognizes Valjean. And now he's like, okay, I'm going to get revenge. I mean, revenge for nothing. Like he paid way too much money for the freedom of Cosette. And then when Thénardier followed him into the woods to get more money, he basically said, I'm not giving you a penny. So he's all flipped out. He's going to get revenge. And the police captain, of course, is who else? Javert. So it's a ridiculous coincidence that Marius sees Valjean and Cosette. The local policeman in that area happens to be Javert. And the Thénardiers lives next door. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, in any kind of modern prose setting, I think an editor would be like, you got to rewrite this whole section. This is ridiculous. Nobody's going to believe this, But I guess in the melodramatic 19th century, this thing was allowed. But it's this kind of thing that makes Hugo a lesser novelist than Dickens and Tolstoy. I've read 3 or 4 of Dickens' novels, and Tolstoy doesn't do any of this nonsense, but Dickens does some of it, but never to this degree. Like I don't remember in the novels I read. So I've read Bleak House, Great Expectations, the one about the French Revolution, whose name escapes me right now, and A Christmas Carol. And of those 4 novels that I read, nowhere in them were like these ridiculous twists of fate. Obviously in Great Expectation there's Magwitch, but that is the only time that happens in Great Expectation. And then later on, Magwitch actually is going to find him. Like, that makes sense. So it's not like a kind of twist of fate, but it's ridiculous. And then the chapter. So it turns out, in some of his father's papers, Marius. Now we're back to talking about Marius. In some of his father's papers, his father said, I was saved from the battlefield at Waterloo by a man named Thénardier. If you ever discover this man, treat him with your heart's heart and defend him at all costs. He is a hero of the family, whatever. So, of course, once the Thénardier name is heard, I think Jean Valjean says it to Thénardier. Now Marius is conflicted. Like, how do I blow the whistle on this guy? If I fire the pistol, the man who saved my father is going to get arrested. If I don't fire the pistol, this father of this woman who I'm definitely in love with, who has proven himself to be, someone of very high esteem, is going to get really screwed over and possibly harmed. So once Jean Valjean enters the Thénardier, there's a long thing of like the reveal of the Thénardier name, and on the other side of the wall is crouched, Marius with his pistol. Like, should he pull the trigger or should he not pull the trigger? Like, it's absurd. And again, what I've said in previous installments of this is why this book is ripe for a Broadway musical, because it is so full of these overly emotional and ridiculous, dramatic, melodramatic sequences that are just kind of crazy. But anyway, so it all comes towards this, and then, I won't spoil the very end of it, but the whole section ends with the resolution of this moment in time. And now we're on to what's going to come next. But again, we've been introduced to a whole new cast of characters now. There are some criminals running around, although most of them were arrested. There have been some criminals we've introduced to. We're introduced to some revolutionaries. We have Marius in Paris along with Valjean and Cosette. So we're all now in Paris with this whole group of people. And I'm sure, the next section now is going to start to bring them together. And I think there are events in Paris history, in France history, are coming up where there are barricades. There's another revolution in Paris, or there's some other actions that happen. I don't really know much about French history. But anywho, I finally discovered one thing I want to read. I finally discovered the part of the book that explains the title of the book. But here he's talking about poverty. Marius is talking about poverty. Quote, Marius had lived through 5 years of penury and deprivation, sometimes of great hardship, but as he perceived, he had never known the real meaning of poverty, utter destitution, until he encountered it in the person of that girl. To witness the abjection of men is not enough. One must also witness the abjection of women, and even this pales before the abjection of a child. People reduced to the last extremity of need are also driven to the utmost limit of their resources, and woe to any defenseless person who comes their way. Work and wages, food and warmth, courage and goodwill, all this is lost to them. The daylight dwindles into shadow, and darkness enters their hearts. And within this darkness, man seizes upon the weakness of woman and child and forces them into ignominy. Ignominy. I never know how to pronounce that word. No horror is then excluded. Desperation is bounded only by the flimsiest of walls, all given access to vice and crime. Health and youth, honor and the sacred, savage delicacy of still young flesh, truth of heart, virginity, modesty, those protective garments of the soul, all are put to the vilest of uses in the blind struggle for survival that must encounter and submit to every outrage. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, brothers, men and women alike emerge into a composite, like a mineral alloy in the murky promiscuity of sexes, relationships, ages, infamy, and innocence. They huddle together back to back in a kind of spiritual hovel, exchanging glances of lamentable complicity. How pale they are, those unfortunates, how cold they are. They might be the inhabitants of a planet far more distant from the sun than our own. And then he finishes, if they had had a different neighbor, one less self-absorbed and more concerned for others, a man of normal, charitable instincts, their desperate state would not have gone unnoticed. Their distress signals would have been heard, and perhaps they would have been rescued by now. Certainly they appeared utterly depraved, corrupt, vile, and odious. But it is rare for those who have sunk so low not to be degraded in the process. And there comes a point, moreover, where the unfortunate and the infamous are grouped together, merged in a single fateful word. They are les misérables, the outcasts, the underdogs. And who is to blame? Is it not the most fallen who have most need of charity? End quote. So beautiful, beautiful wrap up and a beautiful quote. And really again, this is his Tolstoyan heart, for these unfortunate people, and even recognizing that, criminals and people who are dealing this vilest evil in society. Why? That what they need is charity. What they need is help. And as he says earlier, the sand of these people put through a certain type of furnace will emerge the clearest glass that you can see the stars. Like, it's really profound, wonderful stuff. It's so marred by his clunky narrative style and all the, these chunks of exposition of things that you never see again. Then you get these beautiful passages that are as profound as anything in classic literature. Then you get crazy melodramatic scenes of characters that were set up, 200 pages ago. So it's been a wild ride so far. I tell you, 900 pages. I've got to get to 12. Actually, 700 pages. I got to get to 12. So hopefully I will return anon with reports on book number 4. Thanks for watching.